Comes from the Asian Development Bank, or ADB, cutting 2012 growth forecast for East Asia due to growing risks from the European crisis. The ADB cut its forecast for 14 East Asian economies, excluding Japan, to 7.2% from the 7.5% predicted in September. In a worst-case scenario, if the US and Europe slow as much as they did in the 2008-2009 global crisis, East Asia would grow only 5.4% in 2012. The ADB also lowered its 2011 forecast slightly to 7.5% from 7.6%. Joining us to talk more about it, Iwan Aziz, head of the Office of Regional Economic Integration at Asia Development Bank. Iwan, let me clarify your report. You've lowered your growth forecast in the worst-case scenario, but doesn't mean the region is going to go into a recession, correct?
Correct, absolutely correct.
So what's the basis for that? Is it because Asia is now being more successful in rebalancing its economy away from the external shocks? Is that how it's working?
Well, a couple of reasons. One of them is that if you look at the sources of growth in Asia in the last couple of quarters, it's clearly domestic demand oriented. So that helps, because when the external environment is not conducive like what it is now, and the fact that many of the Asian economies are still export dependent, then it's not only domestic demand, but many of the Asian countries' export are moving to other emerging markets, including within Asia itself. So those two factors are among several factors that contribute to continued resilient growth, despite the fact what is happening in Europe and in the US.
You're talking about slow decoupling, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So if that's the case, when it comes to policymakers trying to shield the region from external shocks, when you look at how China has cut the RRR, when you look at how Australia today has cut rates, do you think policymakers, do you think central banks in Asia are doing enough to shield their own economies from these external shocks?
I think what they have been doing is really taking it very carefully, because they are watching very closely what is happening in the global economy. Because if they are doing too much and too fast, that may also reignite the inflationary pressure, because we just have to remember just 6 months ago, we were all talking about the threat of inflation in the region. So yes, they are now swinging the pendulum towards concerns more of the slow growth of the economy, and that's why they are easing the monetary policy. In some countries also trying to stimulate through the fiscal policies. But they cannot do it too fast and too much at this stage, because no one knows exactly what is going to happen in Europe and in the US.
Iwan, this is Paul Day from Market Securities in London. One of the stories that's been emanating over the past couple of weeks is some of the European banks, there was talk that Crédit Agricole, possibly HSBC, were looking to offload some of their Asian loan portfolios. Is there something that obviously concerns you? Is it something that the ADB will be able to pick up the slack on and keep trade finance going?
Well, of course not the ADB only that can pick up the slack, because many of the domestic demands in Asia, domestic banks in Asia have quite ample liquidity. So it's not so much that they don't have the liquidity. The question is, of course, whether they are going to fill in the gap that was caused by the pulling out of some of the European banks from the region.
Iwan, this is Louisa in London as well. I've been talking to a couple of investors over the past few sessions who indicate that they're starting to see more flows, more willing flows of money to go into the Asian markets in particular. Are you seeing that from your end as well?
Yeah, actually what happened in the last quarter is really increased volatility. That is capital inflows as well as capital outflow, and that creates problems. And in some countries in Asia, it even put heavy pressures on the exchange rate, and that's why monetary authorities in some countries started to intervene in the foreign exchange market. But if we are looking ahead, I am of the opinion that the capital inflows will continue, because if you look at the map of the world, that is still the safe haven, emerging East Asia, because it still offer high return, and the macroeconomic situation is quite stable there. So from every angle you look at it, given the fact that the other parts of the world is not really providing comfort and not providing also high return, then I think emerging East Asia is still safe haven.
One thing I picked up on in the last couple of months or couple of weeks, Iwan, is the fact that, things have been so volatile. Capital inflows come in one day and then they're out the next. Everything's been up and down. Right. Currency's been up and down as well. All this volatility that we're talking about, how disruptive is it for Asian growth? I mean, in terms of how you plan the whole economic scenario for these central banks and for policymakers.
Yeah, well, so far it's rather limited. But as I said, in some countries, the volatility has been peaking, and that is the reasons why policymakers in those countries started to intervene in the market, because they don't want this volatility in the financial markets affecting the overall big macroeconomic pictures, because many of these countries have been able to maintain prudent and stable macroeconomy, which is one of their strengths, and they don't want to jeopardize that just by allowing the current turmoil in the markets affecting those indicators.
All right. Iwan, thank you very much for your insights today. Good talking to you. Iwan Aziz, head of the Office of Regional Economic Integration at the Asian Development Bank, talking to us live from Hong Kong.